So top 5 books. Now I've decided to make this non-fiction just to give it a little bit of unity and not complicate my life too much. And also I've skewed it towards a kind of sort of true crime-ish, defining it very broadly, area, because I am a fan of non-fiction as a documentary maker, of course, but also subjects that have something of the darkness of life in. So, in no particular order, the first book I'm going to choose is In Cold Blood, Truman Capote's landmark of true crime reportage about the murder of the Clutter family in western Kansas, which he originally began writing for the New Yorker magazine and then expanded into a book. And it's just, every time a true crime book comes out that's of any merit, reviewers always say, stands alongside In Cold Blood. But really there's only one In Cold Blood. And if you haven't read it, I totally recommend it. It's compelling, it's humane, it's shocking, it's troubling, and it's when I read it in 1992, I think it was, I was living in San Jose, California, and it was one of those times when you get into a book and it sort of, you become inseparable from the book. Book number 2 is Among the Thugs by Bill Buford. It's really a classic of participatory journalism. It's about Bill Buford, who's an American editor and writer. He became aware of the phenomenon of football hooliganism. And so this American literary guy decided, kind of bizarrely, that he was going to go as far as he could in terms of immersing himself in football hooliganism, to the point of, he never beat anyone up, but he was absolutely on the front line of several riots, I guess, and getting to know these disturbing characters. I mean, there's extraordinary kind of detail, granular detail about the violence. And there's a kind of climactic scene, I think, in Italy. I'm in awe of the level of commitment that he brought, the sort of personal risk he endured and his self-exposure, and it's a terrific read. Book 3 is Genie, Genie, by Russ Reimer. It's not one that I'm aware of it being kind of passed around and talked about in the same way as In Cold Blood, for example. But it's a perfect little jewel of a book, and it's an account of an extraordinary, well, I guess crime, first of all, which was a child who, due to having a very strange father and a vulnerable mother who's sort of enthralled to the father, is raised from childhood in a dark room, more or less tied to a chair, fed, but never really taken out of the darkened room, and never exposed really to language, to any kind of outside stimulus. Aged about 11, she's finally rescued, and then becomes the battleground for a kind of academic dispute to do with how language is formed. Jeannie can't really speak because she's never really heard language. That's the name of the child. And so all these theories about how language is formed and the question of whether Jeannie will be capable of learning language so late, when her brain is in many respects no longer kind of plastic, or no longer at that early childhood stage when language is normally learned. All these questions, it's hoped, will be resolved by studying Jeannie. So it's a philosophical book, but it's also a book about human nature, and it's just beautifully put together. Book 4 is Hope Against Hope by Nadezhda Mandelstam. It's a memoir written by the wife of the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam, and it describes the persecution they both underwent in the wake of Osip writing a poem that was rude about Stalin. They lived under Stalin, under the Stalinist regime. So it's a portrait of Soviet Russia at the height of the Stalinist era. And it's, you know, it also treats the subject of the literary life and what it means to be a poet, but fundamentally it's a portrait of totalitarianism and the way in which, for some reason, Stalin himself had been a poet, and he was a relatively highly regarded poet in his younger days, and he had despite his bloodthirstiness, his total, almost, you know, pathological brutality, he had a soft spot for literature and for poetry in particular. And so rather than have Mandelstam killed, which he would have done in any other situation, he had a policy of just sort of isolating and hounding Mandelstam, making his life difficult but not completely impossible. And so you get this inside look at Soviet Russia, Stalinism, and the nature of this protracted persecution that took place to the point of them eventually, well, Osip Mandelstam being sent to Siberia. My last book is book number 5, and it's Blood Will Out by Walter Kern. He wrote the novel that Up in the Air, the George Clooney film, was based on, and he's written other highly regarded novels. But Blood Will Out is not a novel, it's a kind of literary memoir and true crime book. And it's about a kind of weird quasi-friendship that Walter Kern formed with a man who at the time he believed to be Clark Rockefeller, but who it later turned out was an imposter, a con artist from, I think, Germany or Austria, who had no relation to the Rockefellers and was just kind of a grifter and would make money out of people by pretending to be a Rockefeller, and also was a murderer who at least one, I mean, not that dissimilar in some ways to Robert Durst, the protagonist in the documentary The Jinx. He was someone who went through life opportunistically. Well, I think he's been convicted, so let's say killing, I don't think we have to say allegedly, at least one person, and possibly even more. And the way in which Walter Kern tells the story, and the story of his own kind of being beguiled by this guy who he knew was weird, but at the same time found fascinating, and also never imagined was capable of killing someone. I think it's safe to say that. And hands up, and in all honesty, part of the appeal for me for the book was it helped me think about what the nature of my relationship was with Jimmy Savile, someone who I viewed as weird and a documentary subject, but someone who I also viewed in a somewhat friendly way, and then after the fact learned terrible secrets about after he was unveiled as a predator. So Walter Kern's Blood Will Out is a terrific, page-turning story. It's almost like a thriller in parts, and it's a psychological excavation of this man, the supposed Clark Rockefeller, but also of Walter Kern and himself and his questions about what it was in him that made him pursue a sort of friendship with this guy. Totally recommend it.